Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining Archbold's virtual seminar series. My name is Betsy Boughton, and I'm the Program Director of Agroecology at Archbold's Buck Island Ranch. Today, we're going to have a 20-minute presentation from one of our research assistants, Mr. Nate Spicer. Nate has worked at Buck Island Ranch for a little over a year. He started off as a research intern, but took on a research assistant position about 4 months after starting. During his time at Buck Island, Nate has primarily worked on a project comparing the environmental characteristics of pasture and sugarcane. And he was co-supervised by myself, Dr. Nuria Gomez Casanovas, and Dr. Elena Blanc from University of Illinois. Before coming to the ranch, Nate graduated with a Bachelor's of Science from the University of Toronto with a major in Earth and Environmental Systems and Conservation Biology. His previous research focused on the uptake of mercury by plant leaves and the global mercury cycle. And he also worked as a conservation fellow for the Montana Conservation Corps, and he worked as a research assistant at the University of Maryland on water quality and gas flux in wetlands. After his job here at Archbold, Nate is going on to be the lab manager and research assistant with Dr. Lisa Chambers in her biogeochemical research lab at the University of Central Florida. And I wish him all the luck in that, and thank you so much, Nate, for your work here at the ranch. Before Nate starts, I wanted to give everyone a little bit of background. Nate's intern project is just one small part of a larger 5-year project to understand how the cultivation of sugarcane affects carbon storage and water and nutrient cycles compared to grazed pastures. And the project is funded by the US Department of Energy through a grant to University of Illinois at the Center for Advanced Bioenergy and Bioproducts Innovation, known as CABI. The USDA Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Network also supports this research. And the overall goal of CABI is to provide scientific breakthroughs for a new generation of sustainable, cost-effective sources of energy, such as biofuel crops. And also just a reminder, this presentation includes preliminary data that are unpublished and should not be viewed as a scientific publication from Archbold. So now I'll turn it over to Nate, and thank you, Nate.
Hi, thanks, Betsy. I'm Nate Spicer, and today I'm going to be comparing the water use and carbon sink strength of sugarcane and cattle pasture. Sugarcane and cattle pasture are major agricultural land uses in Florida. The map on the left shows the amount of cattle and distribution across Florida. They're concentrated in South Central Florida. And our local Okeechobee and the Highlands counties have the most cattle. The map on the right shows the distribution of sugarcane production. Sugarcane is primarily grown in South Florida in 4 counties, but most of the sugarcane is produced in Palm Beach County. There is some sugarcane grown outside of these counties, but not in high enough amounts to be shown on this map. So this graph here compares the gross revenue per acre of land of sugarcane in orange based on data collected from the USDA, and the revenue per acre of Buck Island Ranch from 2009 to 2019. So from this graph, you can see that sugarcane makes on average 12 times more per acre than Buck Island Ranch. Keep in mind that this is just a revenue and not profit. Both sugarcane, both sugarcane plantations and cattle ranches have different costs associated with them, and analyzing those are not within the scope of this presentation. Sugarcane can also be used as a bioenergy crop, and this could make it more popular as demand for biofuels grows to replace fossil fuels. Because of these factors, pasture lands could be converted into sugarcane plantations in South Central Florida. So this could have environmental impacts, and this presentation will be looking at 2 important cycles that could be impacted: carbon and water. CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are rising and driving higher global temperatures and climate change. This rise in CO2 is shown in the graph on the left. The agricultural sector in the US was responsible for 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. But agriculture can also be a natural carbon sink by sequestering carbon into soil and biomass. We'll be comparing the carbon sink strength of sugarcane and pasture. And another thing to keep in mind is that sugarcane is also a biofuel, and biofuels are used as an alternative to fossil fuels to help offset greenhouse gas emissions. But when you're looking at the total emissions of biofuels, you have to take into account the emissions from the production of biofuels, and that includes the land that they grow on. And this must be taken into account when comparing the total biofuel emissions to fossil fuel emissions. The next environmental impact I'll be looking at is water usage. This graph shows population with the black line, and water withdrawal is represented by the bars. Water usage is on the rise with a rising population, and agriculture is by far the largest withdrawal, and it's shown in blue on this graph. So understanding kind of how different land use types use water is very important, especially as population grows. The question I'm going to be answering today is, what is the carbon sink strength and water use efficiency of cattle pasture versus sugarcane? So now into a little bit of the methods that we use to answer this question. Eddy covariance we use to measure water and carbon fluxes. We set up these instruments, these complicated instruments, into what we call a tower. And the eddy covariance method has the ability to take continuous measurements. It is minimally disruptive to the ecosystem, and it can measure fluxes across the entire ecosystem. This is crucial when you're developing models. And the research that we're doing will inform models that can examine the effects of the conversion of cattle pasture to sugarcane across Florida. So we use eddy covariance to measure carbon sink strength, which is basically how much CO2 can an ecosystem turn into biomass in a year. We call this net ecosystem productivity, and that's measured directly by the eddy flux tower. Net ecosystem productivity is the difference between photosynthesis, or also known as gross primary production, productivity, and ecosystem respiration, which is the total respiration of the ecosystem. If you have a positive NEP, that means that there was more photosynthesis than respiration, and you have a flux of carbon into the ecosystem. If the NEP is negative, you have a higher respiration than photosynthesis, and that means there is a net flux of CO2 into the atmosphere. So looking at NEP basically is looking at the ecosystem as a potential sink to offset CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. You can kind of think of it as a sustainability perspective on productivity. NEP does not determine if the ecosystem was a sink of carbon or how much carbon is stored. To determine that, you must take into account other carbon fluxes, such as from burning and harvest. That is called a net ecosystem balance, and it has not been calculated yet. To measure water usage, we also use eddy covariance to measure the evapotranspiration of an ecosystem, which is the sum of the evaporation and the transpiration across the ecosystem. We'll be using evapotranspiration as a metric for water usage for these two land use types. And then also another metric we're going to be using is yield. Yield is the agricultural productivity of a land use type, and this is more important from a farmer's or an agronomic perspective, as it demonstrates the usable biomass that these land use types can produce. To measure yield from cane, we use the yield reported by the harvesters. But measuring yield from a grazing land is more complicated because the product of the land is a calf. It's not a grass, and you can't compare the animal biomass to plant biomass. Instead, we use a metric called consumed biomass, which is we calculate it by we collected biomass from movable exclosures and paired plots bi-monthly. And then we did a calculation for the entire year that determines how much biomass was consumed by the cows in the field. And once we have consumed biomass, we can compare it to sugarcane yield, as they are both plant matter. So looking at water usage, we're going to use a calculation called water use efficiency, which is basically how much water it takes to produce a certain amount of biomass. The biomass is the numerator and the water used is the denominator. You can calculate water use efficiency in many ways. Today, we're going to be using evapotranspiration. You could also use precipitation or irrigation or evapotranspiration measured by other methods like remote sensing. So we're kind of looking at two different kinds of water use efficiency, one using the NEP calculated from the eddy flux tower, and one using the yields and the consumed biomass from the sugarcane and pasture, which can kind of give us two different viewpoints of the water usage of the land. This is our study site, Buck Island Ranch. It's around 10,000 acres with about 2,700 head of cattle. And it's a cow-calf operation. This means that we produce calves, which are sold and sent to feedlots and eventually the slaughterhouse. We have two pasture types, improved and semi-native pastures, and a mosaic of 600 wetlands. Circled in red are the study sites. We have the sugarcane field, the improved pasture, and a semi-native pasture. So our two pasture types are improved and semi-native. Improved pastures have planted grazing grasses that are more palatable to cattle, and they are more heavily ditched and irrigated. Semi-native pastures have more native species and less ditching, but the grasses are less palatable and more woody vegetation makes it more difficult for the cows to get the grass that they want. Because of these differences, improved pasture sees a higher grazing intensity than semi-native. Grazing intensity in this case is animal use days per hectare on the y-axis, and we have improved grazing intensities on the left and semi-native grazing intensity on the right. So back to my research question. What is the carbon sink strength and water use efficiency of cattle pasture versus sugarcane? My hypotheses are that the sugarcane NEP, net ecosystem productivity, will be higher than the pastures. This is because the cane naturally just grows bigger than the pasture grasses and makes more biomass. And we also fertilize and irrigate the sugarcane more than we do the pastures, which will drive growth. I also predict that the sugarcane water use efficiency will be higher. I'm using both the NEP as a metric and yield / consumed biomass as a metric. This is because I think the high biomass produced by the sugarcane will offset the higher water usage of the sugarcane. It'll just be so much biomass that even the more water used won't drive the water efficiency down. So on to what we found out. Here we see net ecosystem productivity, or the carbon sink strength of cane, improved, and semi-native pasture. We have tons of carbon per hectare on the y-axis. The blue bars are the NEP of 2019, and the orange are 2020. Remember, a negative NEP means that there was more respiration than photosynthesis, and that means there was a flux of carbon to the atmosphere. So in 2019, we did see a negative NEP, and there was a flux of CO2 to the atmosphere measured by the eddy covariance tower. So now onto why we think this may have happened. Here's a timeline of the sugarcane and a kind of brief overview of the sugarcane life cycle. In December of 2018, this pasture that was to be our sugarcane field was sprayed with herbicide to kill off the grasses. The biomass was then left to decompose. And then a few months later, in February of 2019, the cane was planted. The first year of a sugarcane crop is called the plant cane year. And then in February of 2020, the cane was burned and then harvested. But when you harvest sugarcane, you leave the root structures intact, and then the next year grows from those root structures in the soil. This year is called a ratoon year. On average, you have 2 ratoon years before kind of you start to see yields dropping. And then you have to plant new cane, and then new root structures will grow. Whenever you plant new cane, you have to till up the old root structures. And after the last ratoon, you either do more cane or a cover crop as well as an option. So back to the graph of NEP, what we think happened was the conversion of the pasture to sugarcane could have caused the higher respiration in 2019. All of the pasture biomass left behind on the field for those months was decomposed, and that would drive up the respiration from the soil. Oftentimes, when you convert from one land type to another, you do have CO2 going into the atmosphere. And then in the ratoon year in 2020, we see that the NEP is quite high, higher than the pastures. So it has a very high sink strength compared to the pastures in 2020. So remembering the sugarcane life cycle, in the next plant cane year, we might see another burst of respiration, which could drive this high sink strength of the sugarcane down again. But we needed several more years of data to get that. The 2 pasture types were comparable in their carbon sink strength, so you can see. Here I am showing the water use efficiency calculated using net ecosystem productivity and evapotranspiration. The equation is on the bottom of the graph. A higher number means higher water use efficiency. In 2019, since sugarcane had a flux of CO2 to the atmosphere, that data is not usable to calculate the water use efficiency of the cane in terms of its carbon sink strength. But in 2020, we see that the sugarcane had the highest water use efficiency of the 3 land use types. Cane produces a lot of biomass, which would drive up its efficiency since the NEP is so much higher. And it's possible that the dense canopy of the sugarcane could also drive evapotranspiration down by shading and reducing evaporation, which could improve its water use efficiency. For both 2019 and 2020, the semi-native was more water use efficient in terms of NEP than the improved pasture as well. So now on to the yield, or the more agronomic perspective. You can see that the cane yield is highest for 2019 and 2020. This kind of demonstrates the massive yields that sugarcane can produce and what makes it a desirable crop. To make the comparison between sugarcane and pasture easier, remember we use consumed biomass as like a metric for yield from the pastures. Another thing to keep in mind is on the y-axis, we're using tons of carbon per hectare, which helps us compare it to the NEP calculations we do, which are also in carbon per hectare. You can also see that the semi-native consumed biomass is the lowest for both years, which is probably a result of the low grazing intensity. So onto the water use efficiency using yield or consumed biomass as a metric. You can see here that sugarcane is more water use efficient at producing yield and has the highest. This is good from an agronomic perspective in terms of water, as you can kind of get more bang for your buck in terms of water used. In summary, from an agronomic point of view, the cane is a high revenue crop that is efficient at producing yield, and it also has the potential to become more in demand as a biofuel in the future. These factors can drive Florida pasture lands to be transformed into sugarcane, and this transformation should be studied in order to kind of determine like what impact this will have on all aspects, the atmosphere, the water, and the culture of South Central Florida. From a carbon sustainability point of view, sugarcane had a large sink strength, except for the first year of land conversion and potentially any plant cane year, due to the higher respiration from disturbing the ecosystem during the land conversion and the plant cane. And we also found that cane is more efficient than pasture in terms of water usage to convert CO2 into biomass. To sustainability than just carbon sequestration, there are impacts on the water quality due to the more fertilizer used by sugarcane. This can enter our waterways and potentially cause issues in our streams, lakes, and estuaries. Conversion of pasture lands into sugarcane could also affect the biodiversity of the lands in South Central Florida. And to truly determine the sustainability of these two like agricultural practices, you have to look into the industrial processes that happen after the crop leaves the farm. So in sugarcane, for instance, the stalks are converted into sugar. And for the calves, they're sent to feedlots and slaughtered. So these could have other environmental impacts that should be studied as well to determine the net sustainability of these agricultural practices. So yeah, I'd like to acknowledge all these people for all the help on the sugarcane project and helping me with my project. It's been a great experience working at Buck Island Ranch and working on this project. I learned a lot, and I hope you guys did too today. Any questions?
Great, thank you, Nate. That was a great seminar. So there is a question in the Q&A, and from Josh Daskin. He says, really excellent seminar, Nate. 2 questions. 1, can you clarify if the low carbon uptake in the cane in 2019 is likely to be repeated in all non-ratoon years? And so would it reoccur every 3 years, or is it just because of the initial conversion?
So there's no way we can really know until we have the data. I think our sugarcane crop next year is going to be next year will be a plant cane year. So we have to collect the data for that year to actually see if that will happen. So far, we only have the data analyzed for the first 2 years of the cycle. So this is why it's important for the study to be 5 years, so we can capture kind of all the different parts of the sugarcane life cycle.
Great, and I wanted to introduce everybody to Dr. Nuria Gomez Casanovas, who's joined us on our panel, and she's here to answer questions too. There is another question from Josh. Are there any land management activities that can improve carbon sink in pasture vegetation or soil, especially in semi-native areas?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure, Nuria or Betsy, if you have any insight into that.
Yeah, there are practices in both like improve and semi-native pastures that could increase the carbon sequestration. For instance, with Betsy, we have been studying how a patch burn affects the carbon storage of improved and semi-native pastures, and at least for semi-native pastures, we are seeing that it can increase the net carbon storage. Also, there are other alternatives and other management practices. In fact, 2 or 3 months ago, the U of I team published a paper that talks about some of these strategies, and those include like from patch burn to adaptive multi-paddock grazing. Other strategies are using agrivoltaics, which is the collocation of solar panels in grazing lands. Also could also have the potential to enhance carbon sequestration.
Yeah, I've also heard that planting legumes and rotational grazing are other practices, and we already do rotational grazing on Buck Island Ranch, and we do some legume planting. Okay, moving on to another question. Aaron David from Archbold. He says, wonderful presentation. With regards to converting pasture to cane, where should consumer dietary needs come in, if at all? For example, I could imagine that beef is more important for feeding people than sugar production.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that's one of the things that I think an economic analysis or like some more, almost even a more like a social science like perspective on that would be important. And I think agriculture is an interesting field in that you can kind of combine like all these different like science fields, and you have to use them to determine like what's best, the best use of the land, and it's a really complex issue. So that's a good point. And yeah, I do think dietary needs should come into account when you're thinking about how best to use land, because beef may be more important than sugar.
That sort of feeds into a comment that Hillary had mentioned. There's an analysis called life cycle analysis that takes into account all the inputs. It calculates the carbon footprint of all the inputs that go into the crop and all the outputs. And so today we just presented the ecosystem part of the carbon cycle, but didn't sort of include the carbon emissions from all the inputs that go into both pasture and sugarcane. And so the full like holistic life cycle analysis would be a really good thing to do for this study at the end. Nuria, do you guys plan to do this type of life cycle analysis?
Yeah, we plan to do that for both. Like we could do it with pastures. Definitely, we want to do it with sugarcane as a bioenergy crop. But yeah, getting back to the question, sugar is more important or less important than food. Then you add up the bioenergy debate, and so that it's even like more complex, like food versus energy and yeah, everything else. But yeah, going back to Betsy's question, yeah, we are planning on adding this component. And in fact, Elena Blanc-Betescu, who's also working in this project, she has been able to develop an LCA that is locally specific. So it's way much more accurate than other type of LCAs that you can use.
Here's a question from Nyla Pipes. She says, what's the next step in your study? And I'll let Nate and then maybe Nuria take. So
I think really the next step in terms of the carbon portion is looking at the net ecosystem carbon balance. So when you like right now, we're kind of just looking at data collected by the eddy covariance towers, and there are carbon losses that aren't captured by that. So there's carbon losses from the burning of the sugarcane and from the harvests. And we have ways to calculate these things, and they're going to be used to calculate this net ecosystem carbon balance. And Nuria can tell you more about it as well, if I'm missing anything.
No, that's correct. So yeah, one of the next steps would be the net ecosystem carbon balance, and we already have like an estimate of those values, and we found that over the 2 years, the sugarcane was a carbon source, which is not unexpected because of what you just said, right? Like the burn and harvest. And compared to pastures, the improved pasture was pretty much a carbon, well, it was carbon neutral. And that was, so these calculations were including the amount of biomass or carbon that is removed by grazers, as well as burning the improved pasture. And the semi-native pasture was a sink of carbon, a net sink of carbon. Yeah. And next steps also, like as Nate mentioned in his presentation, would be like, well, keep doing the research that we are doing, and also adding the phosphorus cycle, water quality, biodiversity, etc., as he mentioned already.
I have a question for Nate and Nuria. Were you surprised looking at the comparison of improved to semi-native? Were you surprised about like the NEP results that showed semi-native was like greater than or equal to improved pastures? Because I kind of thought improved pastures were more productive, so they might have a greater NEP.
Yeah, they're Nuria, do you want to go ahead and answer this one?
I'm not sure I can answer this one.
Yeah, it's a little, yeah, we have like, I have the like GPP graph in here, and we can look at it as well. You can see the gross primary productivity. I think it's here, you can see kind of yeah, that's weird that the improved, the semi-native has the lowest GPP here, but it has a high NEP, and I guess that means the respiration was lower.
Yeah, I think it's I think that what's happening is that in improved you have a higher GPP than in semi-native, but you also have higher ecosystem respiration in improved than semi-native, and that is balancing up, right? And then the net ecosystem productivity is similar between both. And to me, this is suggesting that probably they have a similar carbon use efficiency, and that in order to enhance the sequestration potential of any of them, we would have to tackle and enhance the carbon use efficiency.
I see, that makes sense. Let's see, there's a question from Lydia Landau. What do you think a longer term study could show about the impact on capacity for carbon capture as a result of regular tilling of cane fields? Might repeated tilling over time change NEP during cane years?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think generally the like carbon sink potential of agriculture kind of reaches a balance where it'll fluctuate more than it adds more carbon into the soil. And I think that's partly due to the tilling, and you have more bare soil and more respiration, and just, yeah. So a longer term study might show, which would kind of show us what happens to the carbon.
And a couple more questions. What Ben Butler asks, or he says, thank you for the presentation. What type of grass was used for improved pastures, and any plans to consider different types of improved grasses?
I think we mainly use Bahia grass. I don't know if there's any other, Betsy, any other big ones we use in our pastures.
Sometimes limpo grass or Hermophria is another one that we use, and that could have a different carbon sink strength, I think, because that grass is a lot bigger than Bahia grass, at least on the above ground part.
Mm-hmm.
But we haven't thought about that as a next iteration of an experiment we could try and compare, but that's a good idea. Okay, and final question. Great from Maya, great presentation, Nate. Could you briefly tell us again the total water usage of cane versus pasture?
So we do irrigate. One thing to keep in mind is that we do irrigate the sugarcane more than we irrigate the pastures. So because the plant like needs more water. And I don't have the numbers on it. It hasn't been calculated, but we do have data that can show it for these 2 years, the total water used. So water use efficiency, we use a metric, we use evapotranspiration as our water use metric. When you're calculating water use efficiency, you can also use irrigation and precipitation. And that would be kind of one way to see a different perspective on water use efficiency. And yeah, that's a good point that we do need to keep in mind that sugarcane uses a lot of water. And we irrigate more than pastures.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. Thank you to the audience for all these great questions. And thanks everybody for coming. Laura, do you have any announcements?
Just one. We hope everyone has a safe and happy holiday season. This is our last seminar of the year. And while we don't have anything scheduled to announce yet, please just continue to check our website, newsletter, and Facebook page for information as it comes for next year's seminars. And we'll see you then.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nate, and good luck with your new job.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, Nuria.
Thank you, guys. Nate, great job.
Thanks, Nora. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye.